Ryan, what right do you have to tell the Israelis how to deal with Palestinian protesters? They were just defending themselves, right? Wrong. And watch on to learn why. Hi, I'm Ryan F. Gassian. This month, the United States Embassy had its opening in Jerusalem. On the day of the ceremony, 60 Palestinian protesters were killed by Israeli snipers, and over 1,000 were injured. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau called Israelis' actions an excessive use of force and demanded an investigation. UN human rights spokesman Robert Colville said that lethal force may only be used as a measure of last, not first resort, and only when there is immediate threat of life or serious injury. Approaching or crossing a border fence, as he said, was not sufficient grounds. Not all have criticized Israel for how it handled the protests. US UN Ambassador Nikki Haley was quoted as saying, "I asked my colleagues here in the Security Council, who among us would accept this type of activity on our borders? No one. No country in this chamber would act with more restraint than Israel has." There are no doubt Canadians who share her view. Indeed, under Stephen Harper's government, Canada was silent whenever Israel cracked down on the Palestinians. Now, I could easily counter their arguments by saying that Canada has had protests in the past, and that we typically don't resort to shooting metal bullets, even when some of the protesters become unruly. And yes, some of the protesters in Gaza burned tires and threw rocks. Some even lit kites on fire and sent them over the fence. However, most protesters were reported as being peaceful, and videos of the events showed Israelis firing on unarmed civilians, not vigilantes. It should also be noted that not a single Israeli was injured, let alone killed. Yet I know such arguments will fall on deaf ears. My opponents would say that the Palestinians would kill Israelis if they could, and have in the past. There is truth to this. Israel has suffered suicide bombings over the years, and these cowardly acts should be condemned in the strongest terms. No action Israel has committed warrants such a response. Israelis should be able to go about their lives without fear of being maimed. I also realize how easy it is for Canadians to ignore the plight of the Palestinians because they are not us. They don't speak our language. Many of them don't share our religion. Instead, I will do what all good science fiction writers have done in the past and tell you a story, one I hope will illustrate my point. Imagine that the year is 2100. Climate change has risen the Earth's temperature by a whole 2 degrees. Florida is underwater. Half of California is on fire. And much of the Midwest has been transformed into a desert by decades of drought. Things are even worse south of the border. Trump's border wall has finally become a reality, and lethal force is used to ensure that Mexicans can't escape their country, a nation being torn apart by famine, war, poverty, and disease. At this point, the American empire has collapsed. It no longer has military bases overseas, and it has decommissioned its mighty aircraft carriers, so it can't invade countries like Iran, Iraq, or Afghanistan. Not that it would want to. While these nations might still be rich in oil, global warming would have turned them into outdoor ovens. During the summer months, we might see temperatures as high as 70.7 degrees Celsius, as is already the case with the region of Iran called Dash-e-Lut. In this scenario, with large swaths of its territory being claimed by rising tides or shifting sands, the United States has only one option to address the plight of dwindling resources: acquire more land by moving north into Canada and annexing it. The Americans could use an old argument, one that has been employed many times in the past, to justify this. We Canadians aren't using it, and they would be correct. We Canadians use probably no more than 10% of our land. This seems unlikely, but let's suppose that they did. Let's imagine that the Americans confined we Canadians to our existing cities or moved us into reserves. We would not be allowed to travel from one reserve to the other, just as the Palestinians are not allowed to go from Gaza to the West Bank. Some Canadians would no doubt be unhappy with their lot and decide to lash out violently, just like those fighting for Hamas. The Americans would use these acts of terrorism to justify arresting people without a warrant and detaining them indefinitely. Eventually, they'll start shooting into crowds, the vast majority of whom were doing nothing but peacefully marching to the limits of these reserves. But the Americans would argue that a few were burning tires and throwing stones, so they had no choice but to gun down unarmed Canadians, and they would call any who condemned them anti-American. Again, I could see you thinking that this could never happen, but remember, it has in the past. We Canadians were not native to these lands. We immigrated from England or France and took Canada from the Aboriginals. We placed them on reserves, typically areas with few resources, and from the 1840s to 1996, we kidnapped over 150,000 of their children and housed them in residential schools. The conditions at these schools were so bad that an untold number died, though estimates place the death toll between 40,000 and 20,000. Many of the survivors will go on to develop residential school syndrome, a form of post-traumatic stress disorder, which affects not only those who attend these schools, but future generations, since the offspring of survivors must grow up in families where one or more members are struggling with alcoholism, depression, and other mental disorders, all of which manifested as a result of them spending time at these institutions. The Americans were just as bad, if not worse. What we Canadians did could be called cultural genocide, but the Americans gauged in a slaughter. The massacre of Wounded Knees, the Trail of Tears, and the American Indian Wars. Countless Aboriginal people died to pave the way for Western expansion. This doesn't even touch the fact that the United States annexed Texas in the Mexican War, or Hawaii in the Spanish-American War. This is partly why I think so many Canadians and Americans have had a hard time calling out the Israelis. Our history is rich with colonialism. We acquire our land by taking it out from someone else. Who are we to judge the Israelis? And if we demand that they set aside some of the land they stole from the Palestinians, does that mean we Canadians have to do the same? Toronto once belonged to the Mississaugas, and they only leased us the land. Do we have to give it back? And if we do, what becomes of the almost 6 million Torontonians who currently live there? There are many who still believe that acquiring land through war is acceptable. Bill Maher, a famous left-wing comedian, argued that when trying to justify Israel's occupation of the West Bank, what he neglected to mention was that the UN, the very world body that gave Israel statehood, also outlawed the acquisition of land through force. You can occupy another's territory during hostilities, but eventually you must give it back. When we Canadians did it, while it was morally wrong, it was still technically legal. That was no longer the case in 1967 when Israel took control of Palestinian land. Now, you might argue that it all happened in the past, that the dark scenario that I have outlined could never come true. Would it interest you to learn that much of it already has? It's all a question of degree, you see. For example, California had a record number of forest fires last year. Global warming didn't cause them, just made them worse. The same could be said of hurricanes. They have always been forming off the Gulf of Mexico, but now they are stronger and more frequent. And as these extreme weather events become more common and more destructive, wars, like the one being fought between the cartels in Mexico, will only intensify. People will not only be fighting over drugs, but also dwindling resources like land and fresh water. This will push many nations around the world to the brink of collapse. Canada, on the other hand, is uniquely positioned to benefit from global warming. According to Lawrence C. Smith, a geographer for the UCLA, says that climate change could turn Canada into a global superpower by 2050. This is because rising temperatures will mean more arable land for us, which in turn means more land to grow crops and build cities. Canada also has 10% of the world's supply of renewable fresh water. Finally, this will open access to minerals and other natural resources currently inaccessible because of colder climates up north. America might look at our good fortune and think, why should the Canadians have all the luck? Let's just take it all for ourselves. I've already mentioned how the Americans built their nation on the graves of Aboriginals, as well as with the sweat and labor of African slaves. Yet these are hardly the only examples of their colonial aggression. During the Spanish-American War, the U.S. invaded and conquered Cuba. They painted themselves as liberators, but in truth, they enslaved the Cubans, so American corporations could exploit their island's wealth. Most Americans think their dispute with Cuba goes only back to the 1960s, but the Cubans see themselves as having been at war with the United States since 1898. A more recent example is Iraq. Many Americans might take exception to comparing the Spanish-American War to Bush's adventures in the Middle East, but if you examine the two, you'll find stark similarities. In fact, the earlier wars laid the groundwork for all future American ventures by reconciling America's growing imperialist ambitions with its liberal roots. How did it manage this, you might be wondering? By using media to craft false narratives to justify naked aggression. In the lead up to the war, American newspapers fabricated stories of atrocities being committed by the Spanish. While revolution was taking place in Cuba at the time, the press sensationalized these reports, though it took exploiting a real tragedy to get America into Cuba. On the evening of February 15th, 1898, the USS Maine sank and 14 sailors died. American newspapers claimed that the Spanish were behind it. The real cause for its sinking was never determined, but the media didn't care, as William Randolph Hearst made clear when he told a photographer who didn't think the war would happen, "Please remain. You furnish the pictures, I'll furnish the war." A century after the sinking of the USS Maine, we saw similar forces at work to get America into Iraq. MSNBC, then partly owned by General Motors, one of the world's largest military contractors, and other media networks helped the Bush administration make the case for war. They hyped fabricated evidence about WMDs and exploited the tragic events of 9/11. This wasn't about national security or liberating the Iraqi people, but about gaining access to Iraq's oil fields. I don't bring up these two examples to demonize the US, but show how propaganda works and understand what we are seeing in the press today is propaganda. Did some protesters in Gaza burn tires? Yes. But have you ever seen a soccer riot? The police don't gun down soccer hooligans as they set fires to cars or throw stones through windows. The Israelis claim they had no choice because the protesters were too far away to hit with rubber bullets. If rubber bullets couldn't reach them, then the snipers were never in danger. Here's more propaganda. The White House claimed that Hamas was to blame for the violence. Some in the crowds might have been part of Hamas. That doesn't justify shooting civilians, especially if you're in no danger. Now, some say they had bombs. Well, show me. Show me these bombs. There were no bombs. And even if Hamas was involved, it didn't force the protesters to walk up to the gates, no more than it made the Israelis shoot the backs of unarmed civilians as they ran away in panic. This is scapegoating 101. Imperialist powers have always been doing this. Look at how Aboriginals have been portrayed in literature. We see images of them attacking settler convoys and scalping the heads of women and children. There is evidence that some engage in scalping, though historian Roxanne Dabra-Orts argues that they likely learned it from the invading British soldiers. During the Pequot War, fought in the 1640s, colonial officers offered bounties on the condition that they were provided scalps. How ironic that we bring up this practice to show how savage, how beast-like the Aboriginal people were, yet it was likely we who introduced it to them. The Palestinian people have also been treated similarly in the press. On Fox News, we are shown endless footage of Palestinians burning tires or throwing rocks, but never videos of Israeli snipers shooting unarmed civilians. This creates the illusion that the Palestinians are always the aggressor, whereas the Israelis are portrayed as weary defenders. That's not to say that that isn't always the case. Again, Israel has suffered waves of suicide bombings, but this conflict isn't one-sided. Both sides have acted as the aggressor. It's just that you might not be aware of this if you watch Fox News or other Western networks. That's where the propaganda comes in. Not in what they say, but in what they show and don't show. Now, before I end, I want to emphasize that not all Israelis are for occupation or the brutal crackdown we witnessed in Gaza. the blame falls on Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the Likud party. Likud is the right-wing party that currently controls Israel. Many Israelis don't share its views. Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, the former leader of the left-leaning Labour Party, died trying to forge a lasting peace between Israel and Palestine. He was assassinated by Yigal Amir, a pro-settlement Israeli extremist who opposed the peace deal. It is incumbent upon we Canadians to stand shoulder to shoulder with those Israelis who are for peace, not the warmongers. Finally, let's pretend again that the dark scenario I outlined did come true, and Canada was annexed by the United States. Who would come to our defense, and more importantly, why should they? If we Canadians won't do what is right and support the Palestinians, why should anyone else come to our defense if we ever befall a similar fate? Given that centuries earlier, we Canadians stole Canada from the Aboriginals and threw them into reserves. One might even call it poetic justice. Thank you for listening, and please help my channel by liking this video and subscribing. Oh, and visit my website at www.darknessinamerica.com to read my short stories about a future United States where people live in fear of inquisitors, telepathic assassins who police the populace for thought crimes.